The following Stateline History Special is made possible by the Oklahoma Centennial Commission. Celebrate Oklahoma, a unique history, an extraordinary future.
Without the oil industry, Oklahoma would probably be South Dakota.
The history of Oklahoma is inextricably intertwined with the history of the oil business. Black gold created an incredible amount of money for the oil companies established here.
We're talking about millions of dollars, and we're talking millions of dollars back in you hate to act flippant about it, but that was back when a million really meant something.
And the men behind those companies are an integral part of the fabric of the state.
Without the oil industry, without these philanthropists, these oil men providing thousands and thousands of jobs, this state would be a very different place.
You've heard the names. On this edition of Stateline, meet the men: Getty, Marlin, Noble, Phillips, Oklahoma's Roilty.
Oklahoma's oil empires began with the sound of a gavel under the rustling leaves of an elm tree near Pawhuska. Oilmen with names like Phillips, Skelly, Sinclair, Marlin, and Getty stood in its shade and sealed million-dollar deals to drill the largest oil fields in the world.
So many deals were made on a handshake, quite frankly. Bidding wars for different oil leases and different oil fields all through Osage County were done under this famous elm tree.
You talk about high-stakes poker. What people were paying for the right to drill these wells went from pennies to hundreds of dollars, magnifying itself many times over in a very short period of time. As people were going out and leasing this land and then hitting these gushers, and the value of oil was starting to go up, all of a sudden what these men, Frank Phillips and Marlins and others, were willing to go to Pawhuska and pay for these leases just went out of sight.
While they all found their fortunes in the oil patch, they had very different ways of running their empires and spending their money. When Ernest Whitworth Marland arrived in Oklahoma, he had already made his first million in the Pennsylvania oil fields and lost it in the banker's panic of 1907. At age 33, all he had was his experience and a line of credit.
By 1907, of course, our statehood year, there were a few people who were discovering oil in Oklahoma. There had been oil discovered around Bartlesville, the Nellie Johnstone well, around Bixby, and around southern Tulsa area, Glenpool, in those areas.
A friend introduced Marlin to the Miller brothers, who owned the 101 Ranch near Ponca City. Together, they drilled 8 dry holes.
He had actually been riding the prairie with the Miller brothers, and they went out to go see the Ponca Indian Reservation Cemetery, which can be quite elaborate, and they saw topographical features basically that made him think that there was oil there. So the Miller brothers hooked him up with White Eagle.
Chief White Eagle reluctantly agreed, and drilling began on what would be the well that would make or break E.W. Marland.
The well was dubbed the Willie Cries for War number 9, and probably maybe drilling at a slight angle so they didn't destroy the sacred land. Actually were able to drill under, and of course that is where oil was. And so he hit the gusher. This could be urban legend, but it's said that he would hit almost 19 out of 20 attempts after that. Literally, he found oil at the 101 Ranch. He found oil at the Tonkawa fields, the Three Sand fields, the Blackwell fields, the Burbank fields, on and further into Osage County. Not only did he want to drill for oil and then ship it, he needed to refine it, and so he had started his large refinery. one of the first inland refineries in the country and still one of the largest inland refineries. But he also knew that he needed to be able to store oil so that he would always have an adequate supply for refining. And so he set about building a tank farm. As luck would have it, or as his maybe planning skills had it, when World War I broke out in the late teens, Marland had more oil stored above ground than anyone in the world. And Mr. Marland's millionaire status went to multimillionaire status.
70 miles to the east, 11-year-old J. Paul Getty and his family moved into a hotel in the oil boomtown of Bartlesville.
He was there on one occasion to see one of the wells where they shot it with the nitro and it blew in and the oil gushed over the top of the derrick, and he just was so impressed and immediately caught up in the excitement of it all and knew then that he wanted to be in the oil business for his life's career.
Like Marland, Getty had some experience in geology, worked in the oil fields, and had a flair for picking up good oil leases on the cheap. But that is where the similarities end.
At age 23, he made his first million. Then he went back to California, continued in the oil business. By this time, his father had formed Getty Oil Company, and J. Paul obtained a 1/3 interest in that.
Getty traveled the world living the life of a playboy.
He had 5 wives, married and divorced them all, had 5 children, but spent virtually no time with any of them. His father was a little put off by J. Paul's lifestyle, his womanizing and so forth. So he left the controlling interest in Getty Oil Company to J. Paul's mother. J. Paul got a chunk of it and was president. And immediately, of course, he set out to get complete control and finally convinced his mother to sell her interest to him. And he confided to a friend that today I fleeced my mother out of her share of Getty Oil.
If there was ever a polar opposite to Getty, it was Lloyd Noble. Family and friends say Lloyd Noble was born old. When he wasn't at school or church, he was making deliveries for his family's hardware store. For the Nobles of Ardmore, hard work was a fact of life. After attending OU and then joining the Navy during World War I, Lloyd borrowed money from his mother to drill a well at the Healdton oil fields.
Lloyd Noble had success in contradistinction to others because not only was a hard worker, but he was a big thinker, and he was willing to take some risk.
That first gusher quickly grew into a company with wells in 24 states and Canada.
He will say that his only key to success was having the ability to acquire good people and to keep them. And they said, is Lloyd Noble a hard man to work for? And he said, no, he's not a hard man to work for, but he's a hard man to loaf for. So, meaning that if you want to work for Noble, you need to be going full speed.
Drawn by dreams of black gold, the Phillips brothers, L.E. and Frank, found themselves in a wild and dangerous place, Bartlesville.
There was no Oklahoma. It was just Indian territory. And these roustabouts that were coming here, most of them were people who were fleeing their past, typically back east, either criminals or just looking for a new future or whatever. And so these guys were making up the crews that were drilling oil wells.
L.E. and Frank drilled 3 wells here, and they were all dry holes. They said they had just enough money to try one more, or they were going back to Creston, Iowa.
Barely had the money to drill a 4th one, which was the Anna Anderson, which came in, was a gusher, and as the story goes, the rest is history.
With number 4 being a gusher, they then drilled 80 more that were gushers all in a row.
We're talking about millions of dollars, and we're talking about millions of dollars back in you hate to act flippant about it, but that was back when $1 million really meant something.
Frank Phillips built a house on 10 acres in town. It immediately became the center of Bartlesville's social life, with his wife, Jane Phillips, running it all.
She had regular tea parties, she had regular bridge parties. They had many different dinner parties. It was expected that just about every night they were here at the house, they would be entertaining someone for dinner.
When not entertaining, Frank Phillips was doing business, many times as he was getting ready in the morning.
The barber would come in every morning between 5:30 and 6 to give him a shave.
In a time when most people had an outhouse or a chamber pot, Phillips had a marble and soapstone bathroom, complete with a refrigerator and an ice maker.
He had a dry heat Turkish sauna, and he would get into it on a regular basis, sweat out the impurities of his body. Also up in that area, there is a metal box that has different compartments in it right next to the toilet, and that was where he kept smoking supplies. It also has a cigar lighter in it that is very similar to a cigarette lighter that's in a car today. Jane had a car at one time that she kept in the carriage house. It was hers, and it was an electric car, which is somewhat surprising since Frank was into petroleum.
And Frank Phillips, the man who made his fortune from products that powered the world's engines, never learned to drive.
With the money that he had, he saw no real purpose in learning how when he could depend on his chauffeur.
The house in town belonged to Mrs. Phillips, but the lodge outside of town, Woolaroc, belonged to Frank.
There's a mystique about the Osage Hills that I think captured Frank early on, and I think that as he built and created this place, I think that it just captured that whole ambiance.
Woolaroc was Phillips' getaway and his secret weapon.
He cut many a business deal under the guise of vacation at Woolaroc.
High above Clyde Lake, Woolaroc was a playground for the rich and famous and thousands of exotic animals.
Started off with a buffalo herd that he brought in about 1928 from South Dakota, a large elk herd, deer of all different types, Scottish Highland cattle, llamas, ostriches, giraffe, camels, zebras. Bought an old lion from Ringling Brothers Circus and kept him out here for a year till he died of old age. President Harry Truman was here, Will Rogers many, many times, so often that one of the bedrooms was referred to as Will's bedroom. Elliott Roosevelt, the son of President Roosevelt, was here. A lot of the leaders of the Catholic Church, bishops, cardinals. Certainly the chiefs and the leaders of the Osage Nation were here. He became very, very close friends with them. Chief Lookout, Chief Bacon Rind were close friends of Frank.
At night, there was always a crowd at the poker table, and anything could happen.
He became good friends of John Ringling, of Ringling Brothers Circus. He had John Ringling in for a weekend, and they were up playing poker with several others, and the stakes grew higher and higher and higher. And finally, Frank had made a substantial wager, betting one of his oil leases, to which Mr. Ringling countered with the circus, and Frank won the bet. Later on over the weekend, Frank lost the circus back to Mr. Ringling, and then about 3 months later, a large package arrives at the ranch. They go to open this thing up. There's a card inside, and it says, "This is a reminder that for one day you own the circus." And still on the wall today above the fireplace on the north wall of the lodge is that elephant head.
In 1926, he hosted his first Cow Thieves and Outlaws reunion, where Frank invited lawmen and bank robbers to a big party.
And the rules were that you had to check your gun at the front gate, which people did, and you were granted amnesty for 24 hours during that period. And there literally are pictures taken of the sheriff posed next to the guy who he'd been chasing for the last 6 months. But for that night, that day, they were having their party, and then after that it was King's X, and then the chase was back on the next day.
While Phillips wanted to preserve the Wild West, Marlin built a $5 million palace to bring the sophistication and style of an English country gentleman to the dusty plains.
At least in their minds, they decided that eventually they would like to come back to Ponca City and build something of a replica of the Davanzoni Palace. And Mrs. Marlin, we believe, probably called it, possibly jokingly, but at least called it the Palace on the Prairie.
The palace is an acre under one roof with hand-painted ceilings in the banquet hall, rooms lined with oak from the royal forest in England, and mosaics made from tiles of 24-karat gold. And what is a palace without a party?
The social life of Ponca City was on a grand scale. Money was not an issue. People learned fox hunt and learned polo, and it became almost an acquired social skill. You can imagine the grand parties, the latest probably trends from New York and from the coast as far as the kind of music they would have played. I'm sure as soon as the foxtrot and the Charleston were popular, I'm sure the Marlins popularized them here. They would set up literally what looked like large circus tents. And we understand they would hang crystal chandeliers, and then they would have large tables with linens on them and china and crystal, and so the dining halls were set appropriately. And then you might invite 100, maybe 150 of your nearest friends, and they're all in their suits and ties, and the ladies in their fine dresses and fine hats, and this is their idea of roughing it in the 1920s. He wanted his town to match his oil company and his wealth.
He paid not a living wage, but he paid a savings wage because he didn't want the people that worked for Marlin Oil to just get by. He wanted them to get by comfortably. And so he provided homes, and he provided parks, and he built swimming pools and hospitals and homes for orphan children.
He wanted the city to really have an affluent flair, so he was responsible, at least indirectly, for having about 34 miles of streets paved with bricks. We understand that probably Ponca City had more brick streets in the 20s than either Tulsa or Oklahoma City did at that time. He had planned a major boulevard to completely surround the city. It would have been a 4-lane street, and this boulevard would have circumvented the entire city. There were many, many acres of parks. In fact, we do have many acres of parks today. Part of that plan included major art, and he had probably hoped eventually to build many large art monuments throughout Ponca City, but his first attempt was the Pioneer Woman statue.
In Ardmore, Lloyd Noble was saving his money.
They lived in a modest home, a comfortable, very comfortable, modest home in a good section of town. His first and last most frivolous act, he bought a yellow automobile with black rims and rode back onto the campus at the University of Oklahoma to take part in campus life. Now, after he bought the car and went back to school, his family was very concerned, and they did vocalize that he would probably never be worth a dime. He made a comment one time that he said he didn't know whether money was good or not. He said, money does funny things to people. He said, they get a little bit of money and they start acting dumb.
Noble was one of the first to establish employee retirement programs. E.W. Marlin pioneered paid vacations.
A statement was made that one of the reasons that some of the individuals went after him was that he was too good to his people and was a bad influence on other people in the same business trying to keep up with his pay standards and everything else.
Banker J.P. Morgan invited Marlin to New York under the pretense of making a $12 million loan. He even offered to loan some of his executives to sit in on the Marlin Oil board. Before Marlin ever made it back to Oklahoma, he'd been hit with a hostile takeover. He lost his company, lost his home, and lost the life of a country gentleman that he'd worked so long to create.
He had gone from probably representing 30 or 40% of the oil in the world to, because of some misfortune and some mishandling by others of his money, he's left with no money at all, basically.
Marlin Oils became Continental Oil, or Conoco. J.P. Morgan feared that Marlin would start a new oil company and steal away his former employees. Instead, Marlin ran for Congress and spearheaded New Deal reforms that curbed the corporate trusts. After one term in Washington, Marlin returned to the state as the 10th governor of Oklahoma.
He follows Alfalfa Bill Murray, so there's a huge contradiction there day and night. But he becomes governor, moves to Oklahoma City and into the governor's mansion, and immediately starts working as much of the New Deal as he can bring into Oklahoma now as governor. He is putting people to work, but the state is broke. we are in desperate times. He's under great pressure, and he has to produce quickly, and he gets very busy. And one of the things that he knows well is that there's money in oil. And even during the Depression, there's still money in oil. Mr. Marlin believed there to be oil under the Capitol property, but apparently the city of Oklahoma City had ordinances against drilling in the city limits.
But the Oklahoma Supreme Court ruled in favor of Governor Marlin, forcing a showdown with the city.
Oklahoma City authorities said that I could not drill these wells. In order to protect the interests of the state, protect the state land, I declared martial law and ordered out a squad of the National Guard to prevent civil authorities from interfering with our operation. The city attempted to enjoin me in the lower courts, but the Supreme Court upheld my contention. So now everything is okay. The oil is ours. Soldier boys have gone home. Millions of barrels of oil belongs to the state.
The money received from the oil found in these wells will go into the state treasury at the rate of millions of dollars annually.
With the state's finances fixed, Marlin planned to return to Washington to finish the fight with the corporate trusts.
But he keeps going back to wanting to get even with Morgan. And he can't do that as governor of Oklahoma. So he decides that he will run for Senate. Apparently, Marlin had hurt him bad enough as congressman in a 2-year period that Morgan wanted to do anything he could to keep him out of the Senate. So he financed the opposition.
E.W. Marlin was defeated in the Senate race of 1940. He and his wife returned to their Ponca City home, but not to the mansion.
They moved for a short period of time into the artist studio on the grounds, and then eventually had the original chauffeur's cottage remodeled with a ground level master bedroom and bath, and retired into that cottage.
Ernest Whitworth Marlin spent his last few remaining days in the shadow of the home that he was forced to sell. He died October 3rd, 1941. Since Getty Oil was privately owned, there was plenty of cash on hand, and when the Wall Street crash hit, Getty seized the opportunity. When Sinclair and Skelly stocks took a hit, J. Paul moved in.
Where Marlin went broke, Getty was able to buy oil companies, whole companies, gain control of them by acquiring their stock when the stocks were at fire sale prices because of the Depression.
By consolidating his resources and opening up the Middle East to exploration, Getty became the richest man in the world.
Mr. Phillips was faced with similar issues back in the 30s when people actually tried to buy him out, and his answer to them was, "I'm not going to sell it, boys. You know, I got plenty of money already and I need a job." During the Depression years, it probably had greater impact some places than it did in Bartlesville, Oklahoma. Even then, we had some amount of oasis that sort of protected us during a bad time. People were losing jobs, but not if you worked for Phillips. You kept your job.
Luckily, Mr. Phillips was just a shade smarter than Marlin, didn't get trapped by the money people, and kept his company and kept his money, and ultimately bought a lot of property and stuff that Marlin owned.
The money helped see Marlin through the last 18 months of his life. Crippled, broken, Marlin now watched as the symbols of grace and beauty he so loved were loaded into a Phillips Company truck.
Back then, they're putting them in the back end of a pickup truck and hauling them 70 miles from Ponca City to Bartlesville.
The fact that nearly 80 years after huge competition, obviously, between Bartlesville and Ponca City, between Phillips 66, Marlin Oil, later Conoco, you know, a race to the biggest and the best and who has the most employees and all of that, that in 2002, the companies originally founded by E.W. Marlin and Uncle Frank Phillips would have merged to become ConocoPhillips, and of course now are married, we assume, forever, and now work together, employees work together, and the cities work together. So it is a height of irony.
Petroleum's influence on Oklahoma began before statehood, and by the year after, E.W. Marland had moved here to begin making his second fortune. At that same time, young J. Paul Getty was working summers at his father's oil holdings. Marland and Frank Phillips both incorporated their companies in 1917, the same year Getty announced his first retirement at age 25. In 1921, Lloyd Noble borrowed $15,000 from his mother to drill his first well. The 1920s were the heyday of Oklahoma's oil barons, particularly Marland and Phillips. Marland lost his company to a hostile takeover in 1929. Getty Oil was bought out in 1984, but there are still some Getty-branded gas stations. Phillips Petroleum remained independent until it was merged with Conoco in 2002, and it became part of the same company that had taken over Marland Oil 73 years earlier. Noble Energy is still drilling today, both in the United States and overseas. And all four men continue to impact our lives years after their deaths through public art and philanthropic organizations, a kind of immortality that is one of the measures of royalty. This Stateline History Special was made possible by the Oklahoma Centennial Commission. Celebrate Oklahoma, a unique history, an extraordinary future.
For a VHS or DVD copy of this program, please send a check or money order for $22.95 to the OETA Foundation, Post Office Box 14190, Oklahoma City 73113. Or to place a credit card order, call 800-879-6382 during regular business hours.